Yangor Wildlife Park, also known as Ningbo Zoo, is situated in the Yingzhou district in eastern China. It is a relatively small wildlife park, but it offers the chance to get up close to more than 200 species of animals. It delivers fun for all the family, playgrounds and rides, the chance to see some of nature's greats. But in comparison to Western zoos, this Chinese animal sanctuary simply doesn't match up. The animals are sometimes taunted into performing to the delight of the audience. The enclosures are small and dirty. The animals are malnourished and understimulated. Maybe it was a matter of time before an animal would lash out. Maybe the conditions in which they were kept was a disaster waiting to happen. In January 2017, tragedy was about to strike Ningbo Zoo. Mr. Zhang and his family planned a Sunday afternoon out at the zoo with their friends Mr. and Mrs. Li. As they walked towards the entrance, Mr. Zhang had an idea. He decided to try and cheat the system, to try and sneak his way into the zoo for free. As they walked along the tall walls on the zoo's border, he looked up, searching for a way in. His wife thought he was being silly and carried on heading towards the entrance gates. The entry fee was 130 yuan, about $18 US. Although considered very cheap in comparison to Western zoos, it is expensive for Chinese zoos, with Beijing Zoo costing just 15 yuan per visitor, or $2 US. While Mr. Zhang's wife and children entered the zoo with Mrs. Li through the main gates, he and Mr. Li scaled the perimeter wall. It was 3 meters, 10 feet high, but there was a tree next to one section of the wall. The two men leapt for a low-lying branch and pulled themselves upwards. They managed to reach the top of the wall and hovered there for a moment, looking for a way down. They would have to jump. Mr. Zhang went first. He crouched down, then held onto the top of the wall as he lowered himself down. His legs were dangling 5 feet above the ground when he let go. He landed with a thud. He was in. Mr. Li followed, dropping down into the zoo grounds. They congratulated each other on their achievement, but now stood another challenge in their way. It was another 3-meter high wall. On the top were metal bars arched backwards. It was clearly built to keep people out, or something in. Trapped between the outer perimeter wall and this inner wall, the men needed to climb once more. But before they did, they noticed warning signs pinned to the wall telling people not to enter. Despite these clear warning signs, the two men ignored them and looked for a way up the second wall. Mr. Li decided to help Mr. Zhang up. As Mr. Zhang teetered on his friend's shoulders, he reached up to the iron bars on top of the wall. He managed to grab one. He pulled himself up and positioned himself between the bars before leaning back down to help Mr. Li up. When they both made it to the top of the wall, they looked around. There, below them, was a tiger, and another one, and a third. 3 tigers on the ground beneath the two men. They had scaled the wall of Ningbo Zoo's most lethal inhabitants. Upon seeing these deadly predators, Mr. Li shook his head and began to climb back down the way he'd come. This had been a mistake. What had started as a bit of a challenge and a sense of deviousness had now turned into a dangerous situation. The two men were photographed on top of the wall by some of the zoo's visitors, both men in their blue jackets, peering into the enclosure, debating what to do. Before Mr. Li slid back down, Mr. Zhang told him that he was going into the enclosure. He had come this far. There was no way he was going to turn back now. If he could just drop down into the tiger enclosure and climb the far wall, then he would be in the zoo, home and dry, and 130 yuan better off. Without hesitating further, he jumped into the enclosure. The tigers spotted him instantly and made their way over. Stepping over the long brown grass, walking past the trees and shrubs, they sniffed the air, their eyes locked onto the intruder. Mr. Zhang had assumed they were docile, semi-tame animals that would likely watch him from a distance or would run away. How wrong he was. As visitors who had paid their entrance fee looked out over the moat and into the tiger enclosure, they spotted the tigers heading towards a man in a blue jacket. This was not a zookeeper. This was a member of the public. They began to shout and scream. Terrified onlookers, some of them children, could see what was about to happen. One of the tigers launched itself at Mr. Zhang and brought him crashing to the ground. It instinctively went for his head and neck, its long canines clamping down around his skull. The man's screams could be heard as he tried to fight back, but instinct was taking over the tiger. It may have been born and bred in captivity, but its killer instincts were still strong. Mr. Lee watched from the top of the wall, his heart in his mouth as he witnessed the tiger mauling his friend. There was nothing he could do, and he sure wasn't about to climb down into the tiger enclosure to try anything either. Mr. Zhang could feel the powerful grip the tiger had on his head. His entire skull was inside the tiger's jaws. He was powerless to the enormous cat. He kicked and struggled. It was a desperate attempt to fight back, but with each passing minute his struggles grew weaker. The tiger ripped the clothes from Mr. Zhang's body, his blue jacket laying strewn across the grass. The other two tigers circled the man, watching and waiting as the third held him tight in its jaws. The incident was captured on video by visitors to the zoo. The footage was circulated widely on China's social media platform, but it's too graphic to show. The attack lasted more than an hour as the tiger toyed with its victim, taking bites from him, dragging him through the grass, and rolling him over. Every time Mr. Zhang tried to sit up, the tiger pushed him back down again. As the tiger readjusted its grip on Mr. Zhang's neck, blood poured from the gaping wounds. The tiger then grabbed hold of his foot and began dragging him towards some trees. Zookeepers had been alerted to the incident, and armed police had been called to the scene. As Mr. Zhang's body became limp, the zoo staff fired firecrackers into the enclosure. The series of loud bangs sent the other two tigers running, scampering into the far reaches of the enclosure. But the tiger that was biting into Mr. Zhang didn't flinch. It continued to devour him. The staff grabbed a power hose and aimed it at the tiger. The water didn't distract the tiger at all. Instead, it began pulling and tugging at his lifeless body, dragging him across the ground through the long grass. A special unit of armed police arrived at the zoo and, under orders from the zoo staff, they opened fire on the tiger. It fell to the ground. It breathed its last breath and was silent. Mr. Zhang's blood stained its muzzle. Saliva dripped from its mouth. Its eyes glazed over. With the remaining tigers secured in their indoor pens, emergency responders raced into the enclosure to rescue Mr. Zhang. He was unconscious at this point, but remarkably, still alive. He was rushed to hospital, where he was sadly pronounced dead a few hours later. What had begun as an enjoyable family outing had ended in tragedy. Not only had some children lost their father that day, and a wife lost her husband, but a tiger also lost its life through someone's stupidity. Almost 97% of the world's tigers have been lost, and with less than 5,000 now left in the wild, the death of any individual tiger is a tragedy for the species. Mr. Zhang's relatives have called for the zoo to take full responsibility for the incident. They claim that the walls shouldn't be that easy for people to climb. They have insisted that more CCTV should be installed on the outer perimeter fence. If security at the wildlife park had been tighter, then Mr. Zhang may still be alive. One thing is for certain: you can take a tiger out of the wild, but you can't take the wild out of the tiger. Never assume a captive tiger is going to be friendly, or you might end up meeting your terrifying final affliction. Established in 1942, Bahawalpur Zoological Gardens are run by the Pakistani government. Set across 25 acres, the zoo is home to many different species of birds, as well as lots of different carnivores and predators. Visitors enjoy viewing jackals, civets, crocodiles, lions, hyenas, and tigers. The conditions in which the animals are housed are questionable, with standards dropping far below what would be considered ethical in many Western countries. But it was a popular tourist attraction and provided education on the various species in its care. On Wednesday, December 6, 2023, cleaners got the fright of their lives when they turned up at the tiger enclosure. They made their way around the perimeter fence and into the indoor dens at the back. Inside, they could see the 3 tigers, but there was something sticking out of one of the tigers' mouths. When the animal turned its head fully to look at the cleaning staff, they realized that it was a shoe. It was a worrying sight, but perhaps a visitor had tossed it into the enclosure. Moments later, they came across a gruesome discovery. Lying on the hard brown mud was a body. It wasn't moving and clearly had some serious injuries to its lower half. Immediately, emergency services were called and the zoo was shut down. But as the investigation got underway, what appeared to be an open and shut case turned out to be something of a mystery. The body belonged to that of 28-year-old Muhammad Bilawal from Greentown in Lahore. Given the condition of the body, it was assumed that he had died the previous evening. His father, Dr. Muhammad Javed, was informed of the terrible tragedy and began to make his way to Bahawalpur, more than 250 miles away from his home in Lahore. As investigators turned up at the site, the tigers were locked away in a secure section of the enclosure. Muhammad's body was badly mauled at the legs. It appeared that he had died from blood loss, and as news of the death got out, there was speculation. Rumors spread claiming that Muhammad was a drug addict and that he had altercations with law enforcement multiple times before. The media painted a picture of a disturbed young man and described him as a lunatic who had clearly jumped into the tiger enclosure. The zoo blamed the victim for the tragedy, stating that he had forced his way into the zoo, likely over an external wall, and had then climbed onto the top of the tiger house before jumping down onto the ground. If he was, then maybe he was hallucinating or was exceptionally bold, believing that he could take on not 1 but 3 Bengal tigers by himself. Having an intruder in their enclosure immediately triggered an attack for the tigers. They typically leap onto their prey using their weight and powerful front legs to bring it to the ground. After delivering a fatal bite to the neck and subduing their prey, they can then eat at their leisure. No information has been published regarding the nature of Muhammad's death. Only mention of his severely mauled legs made the press, suggesting that he died from blood loss rather than asphyxiation. But when Muhammad's father, Dr. Muhammad Javed, heard the rumors flying around about his son, he spoke out. The media had reported that he himself had claimed that Muhammad was a drug addict, but Muhammad's father had never said any of that. Somebody else had made up the story, probably in an attempt to protect the zoo from taking the blame for the incident. When interviewed over the telephone by the Express Tribune newspaper, Dr. Javed denied ever speaking to any media outlet since his son's death. Instead of the claims circulating in the local and national newspapers, he claimed that his son was a bright young man who was never addicted to and who was never in trouble with the law. Another false allegation was that he had identified his son's body. The news reported that he had arrived at the scene and declared that the deceased was indeed Muhammad. But again, that was a blatant lie, as Dr. Javed had not yet arrived at the location when these claims were made. The identification came from an ID card found by zoo staff inside one of Muhammad's pockets. If Muhammad wasn't the lunatic the media and local government made him out to be, then what was he doing inside the zoo after closing time? And how did he get into the tiger enclosure? Zoo staff and lead investigators scoured CCTV footage of the zoo, but there was no evidence of Muhammad on the screens. They couldn't tell how he had even entered the zoo, let alone the tiger enclosure. Investigators needed to determine whether the zoo was at fault or if this was an isolated incident from a determined and traumatized young man. It seemed the zoo were hell-bent on trying to protect themselves by ensuring people believed that Muhammad deliberately put himself in harm's way, and no amount of fencing or high walls were going to stop him. It transpired that Muhammad had a fight with one of the zoo wardens, and as such, the zoo staff made these claims about him. It was far easier to make him out to be unstable than to accept responsibility themselves. With the initial false accusations about Muhammad, the idea that he deliberately entered the tiger's enclosure was believable. But now, knowing that these were false allegations, something else must have happened. His father believed that he slipped from the roof of the tiger house, landing heavily into their enclosure. His fall didn't go unnoticed by the tigers, and they immediately ran at him. As they circled the man, they swiped with their paws as Muhammad tried to get to his feet. But every time he almost stood up, he was knocked back down again. Then one of the tigers grabbed his leg in its jaws, and the others bit him repeatedly. Muhammad would have put up a fight, kicking with his legs and trying to break free. His screams for help went unanswered as the zoo was locked up for the night. He knew he was in trouble. He knew this was the end. Bengal tigers have a bite force of more than 1,000 psi. They can weigh more than 250 kilograms, 550 pounds. With potentially 3 of them bearing down on Muhammad, he didn't stand a chance. Although they were captive animals, they still had their natural killing instinct deep within them. Lead investigators said that it was clear that Muhammad was alive when he entered the predator's enclosure. The fall from the roof had not killed him. They were certain that the tigers had, but they had not feasted on his body. Once he had succumbed to his injuries, they had walked away, satisfied that the threat was over. However, the question still remains. What was he doing on the roof of the tiger den when he slipped into the enclosure in the first place? His father thinks that perhaps he was searching for a way out of the zoo, but if that is the case, it is not known why he was in the zoo after closing time. To try to establish the facts, the commissioner of Bahawalpur formed a 5-member fact-finding committee. The aim of the committee was to assess the break-in, the victim's motivation, and any security flaws the zoo were responsible for. Investigators accessed the tiger den, climbing onto the roof to look for evidence. So far, nothing has been published detailing exactly what happened to the 28-year-old. Although wild tiger attacks are relatively common in neighboring India, especially in the Sundarbans, there are no wild tigers in Pakistan. But animals held in captivity around the world still pose a threat to those who work with them. Just days before Muhammad's accident, a zookeeper was mauled to death by a captive black bear over the border in India's Indira Gandhi Zoological Park when the night den doors were accidentally left open. Although Muhammad's parents still had many questions over their son's death, they did not file a lawsuit against the zoo. We may never know exactly what happened to Muhammad Bilawal, but his loss will be felt by all those who loved him. No matter how real his fate was, no one can truly imagine such a terrifying final affliction. Night had finally fallen, and the young man hiding behind the bushes finally came out. He'd bought a ticket at the Vizag Zoo's entrance that morning and moved alongside the other Pakistani people and tourists through the winding paths, barely listening to the tour guide talk about the animals. He didn't need to listen to the guide's descriptions. He'd been hearing the same rehearsed lines for the past 3 days now. He'd been walking the entire length of the zoo for that long, memorizing the paths and the schedules that the staff fed the animals on. No one recognized him, even though he'd been a constant face for several days now. He was a rather nondescript man of average height, and being a Pakistani native himself, he blended in perfectly with the crowd. He'd spent his entire teenage years saving up money to visit the zoo every few months, and he always came for just one thing: the tigers. The other animals were lovely, sure, but nothing could compare to the majestic tigers. Once, in his late teens, he hid behind a shed when the gates closed, just to watch the employees feed them. He was terribly disappointed to see that they only got chunks of meat and no live animals to hunt, like they would do in nature. That was also when he realized just how small the enclosures were in comparison to the wide outdoors where they belonged. It gnawed at his consciousness day and night that those fierce hunters were kept confined to such tiny, inhumane cages. He decided then that he'd come back one day and free them all. and in the last 3 days that he'd spent walking the grounds, only the tigers recognized him. Their eyes followed him every time he came into their vicinity. He was certain that the cats knew that he was here to save them. They understood, just like he did, that they belonged in the wild. But these were just the ramblings of an insane man who happened to be entranced by tigers. He could have obsessed over hygiene, a TV show, or even another person, but somehow his mind honed in on the tigers kept at the Ningbo Zoo instead. His crazed thoughts convinced him that the focus of his madness, the tigers, were being mistreated, underfed, and caged in claustrophobic surroundings. None of this was true at all, but reality does not mean much to a man in the throes of a schizophrenic episode. He was right about one thing. The zoo's employees did not notice the stranger that kept coming back every day. It was December, one of the busiest tourist seasons in the country, and the zookeepers were seeing hundreds of people going through the gates every day. No one ever paid the man any mind. When the crowd started thinning as 5 p.m. approached and the gates were about to close, the nameless man slipped behind some bushes that were nestled between the tiger and cheetah enclosures. Perfectly camouflaged, the man waited and watched. At 5:30, staff started at the entrance, feeding aquatic animals like hippos and alligators. Then they moved up to the herbivores, the bucks, elephants, giraffes, and such. Next were the monkeys, birds, snakes, and reptiles. It took them 2 hours before they reached the carnivores, lions, cheetahs, hyenas, and of course, the Bengal tigers. The animals knew the feeding schedule well, and they were all pacing the front of their enclosures impatiently. Beside the man, the tigers rumbled and mewled with anticipation, and he slunk deeper into the shadows when the staff drew near. Once it got dark and the park was empty, he was planning on scaling the high fence. And once he was inside, he would open the gates and simply walk out alongside the tigers, setting them and his nagging conscience free. The wait was the worst part. His heart was pumping in his throat, and he counted down the seconds. Staff members came by and fed every animal on the grounds. They took their time, chatting with one another and with the animals themselves. But finally, they left too. But still, the man waited. He needed it to be completely dark. Security guards made their rounds every 2 hours, and he needed to make sure that he acted the second they made their first walkthrough. Only then would he have the most time possible and the complete cover of darkness. When they passed out of sight, he sprang into action, moving to a set of stairs behind the den. As he scaled the stairs, the creature's luminescent eyes followed the man. They'd been aware of him lying next to their enclosure all day, but even so, his sudden burst of movement caught them off guard. For now, they did not move from where they were lying. They'd just eaten, and big cats usually sleep after a meal. But this was an unusual set of circumstances, and they were curious, yet cautious enough to see it play out. They'd never hunted in the wild, nor had humans ever come inside their living spaces without them being under sedation. Their lack of experience and the fact that their lives were constantly surrounded by humans overrode their natural proclivity to devour any living thing that was close to them. For now. Then the man's feet touched the ground, and his warm, living scent became overwhelming. The man stood up and brushed himself off, turning to face the tigers as he did so. They'd gotten up when he struck the ground, and they were slowly moving forward to investigate the stranger. When he saw the 4 felines moving slowly toward him, a wide smile spread across his face. Their slow approach was friendly. Surely they recognized his intentions. They must have sensed that their savior was with them. But that smile was a mistake. His teeth were now barren. For predators, this is a sign of aggression. When his white teeth flashed at them, their caution went out with the wind, and they sprang into action. Simultaneously, 3 of the 4 leapt at the figure, roaring as they did so. The man heard their roars, and they vibrated into his very bones. His look of delight turned into an expression of horror when the pack stormed at him. For all of his preparation and his certainty, he'd never even considered an attack. For the first time since he was a tiger-obsessed child, did the possibility that he could die enter his mind. But there was no time to contemplate what was about to happen. The biggest, fastest male of the bunch was on top of him. It was half a ton of pure speed and muscle. Just the force that the animal hit him with instantly shattered his ribs and one of his collarbones. There was no time for the pain to register, because the tiger bit into the space between his shoulder and neck before he even struck the ground. The man and the beast skidded across the habitat's floor, leaving a groove 5 feet long into the moist earth in their wake. The man's windpipe was crushed, and his chest was flattened by the weight on it. There was no way to scream out in pain from the burning in his chest, neck, and shoulder. He grabbed onto the only thing in front of him, the orange and black fur of the tiger that was on top of him. The animal gave his prey one powerful shake so aggressively that it severed the human spine from his skull and ripped his jugular completely open, leaving only shreds of flesh and spewing blood that coated the hunter's face. When the other 2 tigers reached the scene, and the 4th at the back came running toward them too, it was all over. The man who would forever remain nameless was dead, and they took turns to taste the strange creature that lay dead and unmoving in front of them. The next time that the security guards came by, the den was quiet, and it was too dark to see the body lying among the shrubs and grasses. There was no reason for them to raise the alarm, since there was simply nothing to see anymore. But the next morning, when staff came around to feed the carnivores again, one of the women became concerned that none of the tigers were hungrily waiting for their breakfast. They were all lazily lounging in the morning sun, not at all interested in their scheduled bloody chunks. She peered in at them, searching for a sign of injury or distress, but they all looked perfectly content to her. It wasn't until she spotted the biggest male sitting in the bushes, guarding his kill, that she ran screaming for help. The predator was proudly sitting beside the corpse, happily chewing on a bloody tennis shoe. The tigers were sedated with dart rifles, and what little was left of the body was removed from the cage. They found the place that the man had hidden from the staff, a hollow in the bushes littered with water bottles and snacks, but there was no form of identification among his possessions, and his body was so torn and shredded that there was just no way to identify him. Since that December in 2023, he's remained a John Doe, and no one has come to claim him. Experts have deemed this attack to be a provoked attack, considering that the unknown man had invaded the tiger's enclosure. The tigers will not be euthanized or moved from the park. However, after having experienced hunting and killing live prey, and tasted human flesh for the first time ever, can these tigers ever be trusted around people? Some people believe that it's only a matter of time before they strike again, bringing another innocent person to their terrifying final affliction.